Tonight, we journey into the disciplined, unforgiving world of feudal Japan, where every gesture carried meaning, every mistake could cost you dearly, and survival required more than just strength. To live even a single day in this society meant adapting instantly to rules both visible and invisible. If wandering through these hidden corners of history brings you peace or sparks your curiosity, consider supporting the channel with a like and a subscription, and in the comments share where you're listening from and what time it is as you press play. It's always striking to see how far these stories travel. Now quiet your thoughts, let the room grow still, and step with me into a world where lasting even one day was no small feat. Imagine falling asleep in the Middle Ages, not in a private room of your own, but in a single bed where your children, your servants, or even visiting guests might be lying inches from you. Privacy, as we know it, barely existed. Tonight we uncover how medieval homes turned the bed into a stage for family life, where even the most intimate acts were witnessed. What does it mean to live in a world where nothing, not even your marriage, belonged only to you? Let's explore that hidden reality together. Imagine the bed, not tucked away in a private chamber, but placed in the middle of a room that never truly slept. In medieval households, the bed was not the sanctuary it seems to us today. It was a stage, and everyone in the house was part of the cast. You did not retreat there alone. You lay on straw stuffed into a sack, sometimes lined with old linen, creaking under a weight far greater than a single couple. It bore the weight of a family, a household, even of community. In that space, comfort and intimacy blended with duty and exposure. The sounds and smells of food cooking, fires burning, children whispering, and animals shuffling outside the walls filled the air. A bed was never silent, never untouched by others, and never private. Now, picture the actual structure of such homes. Many were one-room boxes, sometimes with a loft or storage above, but rarely with walls that closed one space off from another. That single room had to contain everything: work, meals, chores, conversation, prayer, and sleep. Families gathered together to keep warm, because fires dimmed by night, and blankets were a treasure not every soul could afford. You might lay down at night after a day of labour, still smelling of the earth. Beside you, children settled in. Servants might take a corner of the same wooden frame. Visiting kin, too, might find a place at its edge. All human life crowded together upon the same mattress, widening and shrinking with need. But the unease settles when you insert into this picture the routines of adults, acts you would frame now as private, yet then carried out under the gaze or presence of others. Think of a child stirring in the same blanket while a parent reached for their partner. The space did not allow for secrecy. The mattress itself betrayed every movement, the straw compressing, creaking, small rustles speaking louder than voices. Even in whispers, speech carried in a one-room home, where every wall reflected sound back into hungry ears. There was no locking of doors, no walls to muffle. What you did at night belonged to everyone's senses. A marriage, then, was not a sealed box of two, but part of the life of the household. Intimacy was not removed from daily routine. It was interlaced. To be married in this world meant to perform partnership inside a collective, shaping your bond not in quiet separations, but amid constant eyes and ears. Rituals of the bed belonged to the family order as much as to the couple. In this way, marriage often became less about hidden tenderness, and more about shared duty. What society expected of you, children, stability, and honour, was visible in signs the whole house observed. Domestic life blurred into marital life, and neither could be split from the other. Examples from early accounts remind us that children, raised in such conditions, were not shielded. They witnessed. They watched parents prepare for rest, heard bodies shift, and understood through exposure, not explanation, the natural connections between adults. Histories speak of children lying with open eyes while parents made choices, a fusion of domestic routine with intimate ritual. This was not considered scandalous in the same way we judge it now. It was necessity, a fact of the architecture and the economy. Innocence was not defined in terms of never seeing. It was defined in endurance, in how children simply absorbed these moments without special ceremony. Think, too, how the straw itself shaped the experience. Stuffed hastily into fabric, sometimes lumpy, sometimes flattened by many bodies, each night it spilled dust. When damp it gave off a sour, rot smell. Nothing silent or pure cloaked that bed. Instead, It was the centerpiece of daily work and daily exhaustion, where sweat-soaked clothes rubbed against each other, where crumbs from meals sometimes remained, where the dust of labour caught in your throat as you breathed alongside others. The mattress told as much about family life as any diary could. It was a living, breathing record of togetherness and exposure. So the boundaries you and I might expect between private comfort and public duty were not firm. They were smeared like ash rubbed into cloth. The family bed was an open site where couples shared not only each other, but inevitably the presence of witnesses. In this world, the household was not segmented. The same walls that protected you from wind and rain also stripped away your privacy. What you did beneath blankets became not only your own matter, but the texture of collective life in the home. This lack of privacy shaped behaviour. A man did not court his wife in secrecy. A woman did not own her desires in silence. Even close companions in the family carried part of that knowledge. To live in a one-room house demanded tolerance, negotiation, and the acceptance that the body and the soul did not belong only to oneself. Marriage was as much a public performance as it was a private bond. In records, descriptions appear of children commenting on parents' habits, servants remarking on their masters, neighbours recalling what they overheard through thin partitions. People did not shrink away from speaking of it. They seemed to accept the fact that intimacy announced itself to the ears of others. When your bed creaked at night, you could be sure it was noticed. Your household knew when you lived as husband and wife, and they might even tease or measure months later when a new child's cry proved what they had already understood. The line between observation and participation blurred constantly. The truth is, intimacy and family life were not two sides of existence, but one seamless whole. You could not turn one off in order to engage in the other. Both happened together. Cooking fires, evening talk, the cry of an infant, and the bond of a couple all shared the same stage. That was the family bed. It was not silent, not private, not separate. It was the hub of the house where birth, comfort, fear, and passion mingled under a shared blanket. So when we think of privacy, of turning a lock or closing a door, we imagine a world beyond the experience of ordinary medieval families. Privacy was not known as a right or even a dream. It was a privilege so rare that most had no words for it. To them, there was no shame in the household hearing what you did in the night. It simply was. They lived with it because it was woven into the very architecture that kept the rain out and the frost at bay. This shared stage of straw, linen, and human life gave rise to an uneasy condition. Everyone lived with the knowledge of each other's bodies, even at their most vulnerable. In that way, the bed shaped far more than sleep. It shaped trust, expectation, and a form of communal resilience. To pretend one could live privately was a luxury reserved only for those few families wealthy enough to own several rooms and thick walls. For everyone else, to marry was to merge inside a crowd, to share what we now guard with doors, walls, and distance. And this openness, this lack of separation, carried a further weight under the scrutiny of faith. Because if the family bed allowed anyone to hear and see, then the rules imposed upon it by the church became heavier still, pressing down on couples who had nowhere to hide. Now the stage of the bed was not only a room full of many lives, it was also a sacred site policed by holy laws. What happened there did not simply answer the needs of bodies and families. It was also timed, judged, and often condemned. The openness that filled the mattress with witnesses became even more uneasy once the voice of the church entered the room, counting out the days a couple might touch and the ways they might do it. 3. Sacred rules in the bedroom. What if even your own bed was scheduled, measured day by day against the calendar of the church? Picture the same one-room house, the crowded bed already lacking silence or secrecy, and now add another layer, a set of rules that hovered over the mattress like an invisible hand. The church claimed not only your soul, but your hours, your movements, and most of all your body. Marriage might have joined two people, but it was not theirs alone to manage. The rhythms of your union were directed from the pulpit and enforced through ritual confession. The act you might think of as natural and spontaneous was carried out under the weight of sacred instruction. The guidance was not vague suggestion, it was precise. Sundays were holy, and therefore off-limits. Feast days punctuated the weeks, closing whole stretches of time. Lent, the long season of restraint, forbade closeness in the bed. Advent did as well. Some penitential handbooks added vigils before festivals, meaning couples might be barred from touching through a third of the year or more. Imagine the calculation of time not in market days or seasons alone, but in intervals where sex was forbidden. It was less about pleasure and far more about measured obedience. Even at your most personal moment, you answered to the church's clock. The unease lies in how this changed intimacy. Instead of bedding your spouse when desire invited it, you followed a schedule. You would count days, perhaps whisper at night about whether it was lawful, as much as whether it was wanted. The mattress that already shifted under the weight of children or servants now carried the weight of sacred expectation too. Any act was shadowed with doubt. Is the calendar open, or have I sinned? Desire never lived free. It was tethered to dates, fasts, and ritual obligations that intruded straight into the heart of the household. And if timing was supervised, so was posture. The rules did not leave the couple to their own arrangements. The missionary position, the notion of man above and woman below, was impressed as more than custom. It was taught as proper order, reflecting heaven's design and natural hierarchy. Other forms of union, if not outright condemned as sinful, were still frowned on as misdirected. The bed was a theatre not of creativity but of duty, mirroring the order of heaven under the authority of men. Imagine being told not only when you could meet your spouse, but how you must meet them, body to body, gesture to gesture. The effect of these restrictions pushed intimacy into something less like personal connection, and more like a sacramental act. You did not make love. You performed a rite that sat alongside baptism, confession, and communion. For the priest, marriage was a channel for reproduction, and therefore the preservation of souls, not an arena for amusement. Pleasure in itself was suspect, and desire had to bow before procreation. Couples might feel affection, but if passion flared, it was quickly shaded by guilt and fear that one's joy was not aligned with the Church's vision of sanctity. A moment that could have been liberation was transformed into a moral trial resolved only by obedience. Penitential guides of the period spoke directly to these issues. These were handbooks for confessors, listing sins and proper penances. Within them were instructions forbidding sex on certain days, within certain seasons, or in certain manners. They spelled out with stark clarity that sex was to be carried out for children and nothing else. Even married pairs who loved one another risked being condemned if they took pleasure as a goal in itself. That doctrine echoed in sermons and lodged itself in confessions, binding couples to a standard that left little room for human longing. To slip outside that frame was to risk shame, penance, and the stain of disobedience before God. Consider the ordinary practical strain this placed on families already closed in by architecture. You lived cheek by jowl in one room, with no corner to retreat to when desire struck. And even if you found a moment, the calendar might block you. So intimacy became twisted into a rare negotiation. Was tonight a permitted night? Was the position respectful? Was the motive procreation? A spontaneous embrace could dissolve under that series of questions. In the tiny space where you and your partner might hope to find relief, another voice intruded, stern, liturgical, unyielding. The restriction bred tension between the possibility of want and the certainty of prohibition. It would be wrong to think couples simply met these rules with silent acceptance. History hints at resistance, quiet and private. Couples did not always confess every act, and not every priest pressed to hear it all. People navigated between their longings and the shadow of church law as best they could. Yet the presence of the rules marked the marriage bed indelibly. Sex could never be trivial fun. It had too much weight. It was holy flesh, carefully timed, carefully acted, carefully confessed if needed. The priest was the unseen witness, third in the marriage, hovering even if the house was empty. Imagine how this transformed the simplest gestures. A hand reaching in the dark searched not only for warmth, but for permission. A kiss slipped into the night might be stopped not by your child stirring beside you, but by the command that this week was holy. Your marriage could feel less like a sanctuary and more like a public act of obedience, tested against a doctrine that allowed smiles at babies but frowned on laughter in bed. The more forbidden days occupied the year, the greater the strain on couples who wanted closeness but found themselves bound by invisible ropes. And yet the rules had a purpose as the church saw it. They protected sacred times from being stained. They kept order in Christian households, aligned with heaven. They reminded every man and woman that their lives were not their own but God's, seen and guided by his attendants on earth. In that frame, the regulation of the bed was not cruelty but stewardship. But to the couple who longed to touch and could not, stewardship could feel very much like chains. The truth is, the medieval bed, already crowded and noisy, was reshaped again by these sacred timetables. Desire became a managed resource. It was no longer a fire you tended when the night grew cold, but a lantern lit only on appointed days. If you thought your own hunger directed your choices, you were mistaken. The church decided. And when you lay there under straw, half listening to the rustle of children, you also carried the echo of priests and penitentials reminding you whether this act was lawful or shameful. That imposed order offered no refuge from doubt. Was too much joy sinful even inside marriage? Was a hushed laugh in bed another mark against you? Could God see gratitude as well as lust? Couples had to negotiate not with each other alone, but with the unseen rules that hovered above their shared blanket. A moment of union, which might have built connection, could instead collapse into worry about spiritual trespass. The holiness that infused the bond was both blessing and burden, tying two souls together, but demanding they treat their own flesh with suspicion. And so, the bed itself became a sacrament in practice and symbol. It was not the playground of human love, but the altar of reproduction and regulation. Intimacy was reframed as duty, a transaction designed for the making of children, bound in by rules that controlled when, how, and why. To live in that atmosphere was to know that one's body never fully belonged to oneself, or even to the spouse at your side. It belonged to the calendar on the church wall and the doctrine spoken from the pulpit. That was the reality. Your bed, already shared with too many, now also shared with God's gaze and the heavy hand of sacred law. But alongside these holy regulations came another layer of dread. For even when the calendar opened the door and the position was sanctioned, there remained the fear that too much passion, or too little, could bring harm. The bed was not only a sacrament, it was also a battleground of health and survival, where physicians warned couples that their very lives could turn on how often or how rarely they touched. 4. The fear of too much or too little. Now imagine being told that too much passion could kill you, but so could too little. This was not a whisper of folk wisdom or a stray suspicion. Physicians of the Middle Ages framed it as settled order, built upon the balance of the body's fluids. In their understanding, health relied on 4 humours: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, locked in fragile equilibrium. Anything that drained, overheated, or left one humour in excess threatened the survival of the whole. Sex, in their eyes, was no trivial indulgence. It was a transaction of fluids, pulling from the very strength that sustained life. To enter the bed was to enter a negotiation with your own mortality. The paradox is plain. You were warned that constant indulgence could wither the flesh, sap the marrow, and drive one into early decline. Yet, at the very same time, restraint and abstinence were said to breed their own shadows: illness from stagnation, fever in the veins, or madness born of bodily tension. The human body, it seemed, demanded release, but too much of it promised the grave. You were trapped between hunger and dread, listening to voices that told you that health itself was riding upon the choices you made, night after night, inside a bed already crowded by family and governed by holy calendar. Doctors gave their cures in the language of moderation. They compared sex to food and drink or exercise, always a thing to be portioned carefully. A heavy meal could sicken, but starvation robbed you just as surely. So the wise were urged to seek measure. Not too often, lest you lost your vigour. Not too rare, lest your stifled seed poisoned you from within. Think of a body imagined not as a vessel of freedom, but as a furnace with fuel to be stoked only at its proper time. Too much smoke, and the fire collapsed. Too little tending, and it died away. Sex became no longer an act of intimacy at all. It became a medical regimen, a cure and a hazard written in the same script. The manuals written by learned men carried this very instruction. They urged patients to consider not only their souls, but their spleens, to weigh their impulses as carefully as they weighed their bread at supper. Some physicians even spoke, almost scandalously, of women's need for release as well as men's, not as a matter of equality, but as a prescription to maintain health. They saw withheld desire leading to imbalances, the body bruised by what was suppressed. That view clashed with the clergy's stern teaching. The clerics preached valour in chastity and elevation in restraint, while physicians counselled that dryness could breed madness or swelling of the womb. Thus 2 voices, equally loud, shouted over the marriage bed. One spoke of holiness, the other of survival. And so, couples slept knowing that love was not only measured by God, but also by the physician's ledger of fluids. The very spark of passion might be praised one day by the body's advisors and condemned the next by priests. One set of laws declared union the seed of life, meant for procreation only. Another spoke of health, urging a timely discharge to keep the humours clear. How might a husband or wife obey both without contradiction? When did duty to God end, and the physician's advice begin? The result was tension so thick it pressed on every intimacy. Guilt for excess, fear of deprivation, confusion at the meeting of 2 authorities, each claiming the right to oversee the marriage bed. Picture the celibate priest, commanding abstinence, and the physician, warning of imbalance to those who abstain. Celibates themselves were thought by doctors to suffer. A man who withheld forever, it was said, risked corruption of the seed trapped inside him. A woman who spent her life without marriage might be counselled as unwell or dangerous to herself. But the lives of monks and nuns exalted the very denial of pleasure that doctors called hazardous. Here again 2 visions collided, the church venerating those who withheld, medicine pitying or fearing them for it. Those voices did not find easy reconciliation. They simply coexisted, like 2 rivers colliding under one roof. Within the home, what started as longing or fatigue had to be tested by these voices. Was last night part of the acceptable balance? Was this week too indulgent, leaving the husband pale and drained? Would the wife sicken if she went too long without answer to her body's tension? Even if no priest stood in the doorway and no doctor scribbled notes, the rules lived inside the mind. The body was no longer yours. It belonged to competing masters who argued about how you used it. You felt not liberated by desire, but measured. Your very health was weighed by your obedience to someone else's calendar or counsel. Think of the image. A couple counting not only feast days but also recent touches, tallying symptoms like accountants. A man gauging his own fatigue, blaming his hollow eyes on too much union or too little. A woman fearing fever if desire was never released. What should have been private warmth turned into calculation of risk. A treaty with sin on one side and decline on the other. Sex was not simply an act of love or lust. It was a fragile balancing act, where error on either edge could undo you. The curious thing is how this belief system framed even spontaneous desire. To crave your spouse was not seen as neutral. It was taken as a signal to doctors that fluids had built to dangerous levels, or a test from God to resist. Longing was evidence of imbalance, something needing remedy through act or abstinence. Imagine being told that your own spark of wanting was either an illness manifesting or a temptation to fall from grace. Lust became symptom. Touch became treatment. The body itself became the battlefield, carrying rules that bore little to do with companionship and everything to do with order, whether holy or medical. So the bed remained an arena, marked by contradictions. The calendar of the church closed its doors on nights that doctors might insist were needed for bodily harmony. Restraint was saintly to priests, yet damning to physicians who saw it as dangerous clogging of the system. The common person, caught in this tangle, leaned where they must. Some heeded the priest in confession, yet followed the physician in practice. Others hid their lapses behind silence. At every turn, though, conscience was split. To be a husband or wife was to be pulled apart by these 2 worlds, never given full peace in union. It may strike you as strange now that the release of passion could be catalogued like medicine, doses measured out, benefits prescribed, side effects listed. And yet this was how intimacy was framed. It was less like poetry and more like a ledger. Sex fit into the same thought world as bleeding, purging, or herbal treatment. Something to drain unwanted fluids, restore balance, and keep the body from collapse. The human urge was thus filed away beside the leech and the laxative, desire domesticated into cure. Still, beneath the weight of rules and worries, people lived by necessity. Health was fragile, crops failed, children died, infection swept through villages, and no one ignored the constant threat of mortality. Against that backdrop, the physician's warning carried power. If moderation meant survival, you listened, even if it robbed joy. Because in that time, where small illnesses often swelled into death, you did not gamble lightly. You accepted that your marriage might not bring romance as much as measured duty. Balance was the law not only of God above, but of the body within. The truth is, even desire itself became a matter of survival. To crave was to risk harm if you gave in unwisely, but to restrain was to invite peril too. It was a paradox that never resolved. One voice praised abstinence, another condemned it. Couples persevered inside that contradiction, seeking measure in an age when nothing seemed measured. And while medicine watched the marriage bed as a site of fluids and danger, the cities themselves bred new shapes of intimacy. For when desire could not be contained within marriage, when it overflowed doctrine and medicine alike, another institution stood ready to absorb it. Civic order itself made room for it, regulating the very act that priests condemned. If medicine shaped how bodies joined, the streets of the towns shaped where people went when those bodies sought elsewhere. 5. The business of prostitution. Behind the weight of sacred warnings and medical fear, another truth walked openly through the streets. The business of selling sex did not hide itself in the shadows, even though sermons condemned it. Instead, it stood under civic order, regulated like the mill or the marketplace. Prostitution in medieval towns was neither romantic mystery nor private scandal. It was a system, visible and accepted, at least by the officials who taxed it. Imagine walking through the stone streets of a busy city. The market clatter fades for a moment, and what rises instead is the call from a brothel marked with its own form of sign, obvious and unmistakable. These houses were no less real than the baker's shop, and the city knew it. They were necessary, or so the rulers believed. Cities did not abolish sex work. They contained it, penned it with rules. Some districts were marked as the places where such houses should stand. The logic was simple. Keep it there, away from the doorstep of the cathedral or the homes of merchants, and you tame the threat. It was order, not approval. But still, the arrangement struck an uneasy bargain. If the church thundered against lust, and if priests preached against the sin of fornication, the magistrates worked with it pragmatically. They tolerated what was condemned, because they feared the chaos worse than the vice. This paradox lingered everywhere. The law that punished adultery also issued permits for brothels. The same hand that fined disorder collected money from the women who lived in these houses. Now, think about what those regulated brothels actually provided. They were more than doorways into lust. They were managed. They offered food alongside sex. They offered a bed not filled with straw sacks shared by children, but one set aside for the transaction. Some carried bathing facilities, or at least buckets and tubs for washing, which to many customers might have been as alluring as the act itself. Supervision existed, sometimes through officials, sometimes through hired keepers, who served to maintain order within. It was commerce dressed in rules. A man did not simply pay for a fling, he paid for the services of an establishment, not unlike the tavern, yet marked by a far heavier burden of judgment. But judgment was precisely what made the business necessary in civic thought. Rulers reasoned that lust was like smoke. It would rise and spread if not carried up the chimney. Therefore, better to direct it through organised brothels than to let it drift into respectable households. The rhetoric painted prostitution as protective. By offering men an outlet in the brothel, wives and daughters of the city were shielded. Licensed sin, they believed, preserved virtue elsewhere. Morality bent itself into the form of urban management. The city told its people, "Here is a place where lust may flow, so that there, in your own home, it is kept in check." The contradictions were sharp. Priests denounced the practice from pulpits, but brothels kept their doors wide. Officials issued permits, fed coin into the treasury, and turned away when the sermons roared. Towns balanced profit and peace against purity. For the women inside, this meant their lives were caught between damnation and duty. They met scorn from the church and inspection from magistrates, yet continued because the framework kept them within a system. They endured not as rebels on the edge of society, but as workers fitted into its machine. That was the strangest irony. Even sin, when woven into public administration, became another part of civic function. Visualize the street signs now. Though not neon, they serve the same purpose. Visible symbols hanging above the doorway or fixed to beams, marking the house openly. No one doubted what these places offered. They were not hidden in deep alleys as we might imagine them. They were often grouped in known quarters, where visibility itself was part of control. A man did not go blindly seeking. He followed signs as clear as any image of bread or ale. In this way, the city announced the sin it also condemned, holding it up like a lantern to ensure it sat on its own stage, not creeping among the streets unmarked. The tension could be felt by anyone passing by. Condemned yet permitted, forbidden yet regulated. That was the daily rhythm of a medieval brothel district. You might feel the pull of incense from the church on one street, and only a turn away, the noise of laughter and song from the houses of women. The contradiction was not hidden. It was in the very shape of the city's life. People lived with it, unable to resolve it, yet accepting it as necessary. They did not erase the women, they corralled them. They did not deny the men, they redirected them. A necessary evil tied with the strings of civic oversight, paid for in coin that found its way back into the same city that proclaimed its virtue. Think of the brothel itself inside. Beds lined up, candles burning low, meals served from shared pots. Women preparing not only their faces but their rooms, waiting for customers under the weight of regulations. In some towns they had to wear certain dress or colours, a marker of their trade stripping them of anonymity. In others, they paid fees like any guild worker, their labour set into the fabric of the city's economy. Bathing tubs steamed, overseen by attendants, while outside the streets filled with the sound of voices. Commerce ran openly. This was not mere lust, it was industry. The morality of the church did not soften. It kept branding the act as fornication, the women as sinners, and the men as guilty. Yet the practice remained because officials feared what occurred without such institutions. Violence against women, public scandals, broken homes, disorder in the taverns, these were the threats used to justify keeping brothels open. At least within their walls there were rules, taxation and containment. Outside of them, lust would erupt unpredictably. Urban life, fragile and dense, required channels for every human need, even the ones considered corrupt. And so, the regulated brothel stood not as defiance of faith, but as companion to it, the city's compromise to keep balance. Still, the women bore the brand of shame. They could not cross into respectability again with ease. They were marked by their work even if their very presence was part of law. They were visible yet not welcomed. Their bodies paid two prices, one in coin, collected by men for services rendered, the other in dignity collected by society's scorn. Straddling the line of tolerated necessity and damned impurity, their lives embodied the contradiction of medieval urban management. People might have walked past their houses daily, acknowledging them with silence, but everyone recognized they were necessary to the city's uneasy order. The truth is, prostitution was not an accident of medieval life. It was cultivated, regulated, and taxed. It was fitted into the ledger of civic control, a known element in how towns contained lust and preserved the structures of family and faith elsewhere. The contradiction was sharp, but it was intentional. Sin was not abolished, because in the eyes of rulers it could be managed, and it could even serve to protect. The medieval brothel stands as proof that society will bend even moral boundaries if civic order is what hangs in the balance. But the family remained at the centre of everything. Even as the city fenced off lust through its brothel districts, parents and spouses in one-room homes sought their own means to manage fertility, pregnancy, and scandal. Because beyond the public regulation of desire, there was always the private question that mattered far more to daily life. How do you control the size of your household when every new child shaped the fragile line between survival and ruin? Families whispered, and knowledge circulated in secret, creating another hidden layer of intimacy that law and faith condemned but could never quite erase. 6. Secret knowledge of contraception. Imagine the silence of a laundry yard, water splashing into wooden tubs, women working side by side. In that noise of scrubbing and wringing, voices bent low, soft enough to pass unheard by men who strayed too near. These were the places where secrets spread. Not about politics, not about war, but about the small lines between survival and shame. Among those whispers flowed recipes meant to block conception, words disguised as household knowledge yet heavy with risk. Prevent the child, prevent the scandal. That was the hidden refrain. The official world rejected such practices outright. Church law treated both contraception and abortion as sins, and secular courts echoed those limits with punishments that could turn cruel. To end a pregnancy, or to try to stop one from forming, was understood as defiance not only of doctrine, but of the very order of society. To bear children was to uphold family line, labour, and property. To refuse was rebellion. Yet the desperation of families spoke louder than decree. Poverty, hunger, the strain of rearing too many mouths, these forces pushed women to search for ways to take command of their own fertility. Medical handbooks, copied and circulated by scholars, sometimes disguised advice within their pages. Beneath lists of remedies for digestion or fever, you might find lines that read like instructions for controlling conception. These references blurred the line between what was considered treatment and what was considered prevention. Physicians themselves argued over whether such measures were even possible, some dismissing them as superstition, others hinting that plants and timing could play hidden roles. While the theologian thundered condemnation, the physician sometimes left the door unlocked, allowing knowledge to slip out where women might bend it to their own needs. Herbs formed a core of this hidden law. Common plants, gathered from hedgerows or gardens, were believed to hold power over fertility. Some were consumed in teas, bitter decoctions taken after unions thought ill-timed. Others were worn on the body, tucked into belts or bound in charms, more ritual than science. Pessaries too appeared in advice. Small mixtures of herbal pastes or oils applied directly, meant to block or to cleanse. The recipes carried uncertain power, more guess than guarantee, yet in the absence of other means they held desperate value. Timing formed another strategy, with traditions passing down ideas of safe days, drawn from observation though framed in secrecy. Women told each other when to avoid their husbands, turning family rhythm into fragile form of control. The risk was not small. To be caught practicing such methods was not merely a domestic matter. It could be dragged before law, punished not only with shame but with pain. Yet the knowledge persisted, hiding between friends and neighbours. Women did not scrawl these recipes in public notebooks where priests might see. They wrote on scraps of parchment folded into prayer books, or carved symbols into wooden spoons as cues. More often still, they carried the methods in memory, passed mouth to ear in moments stolen from chores. Imagine one woman leaning across a line of wet linen, her hands red from cold water, whispering the promise of safety to another whose frame already sagged with too many births. That whisper was as precious as coin. Medical debate added fuel to the secrecy. Learned men argued about whether contraception even worked. Some insisted it was impossible, that the seed once spilled would inevitably grow. Others hinted that the female body held ways of closing itself, of rejecting or dislodging. Physicians who counselled against contraceptives often spoke with unease, suggesting less that the methods lacked power than that their use unsettled moral order. The tension lay in the fact that knowledge had spread too far to vanish. Even if many recipes were ineffective, the hope they carried kept them alive. Hope itself, stitched into daily life, made it worth the danger. Why did women take such risks? The answer lies in fragility. Medieval families walked narrow paths between security and ruin. A poor harvest, an illness, or the arrival of another child could tip them into hunger. A woman tasked already with nursing children, tending house, and labouring outside might see one more infant as a sentence rather than a blessing. Each birth carried danger for her own health as well. Childbearing was a perilous passage. To step back from that edge even once could mean survival. So contraceptive law did not arise from rebellion alone, it grew from necessity. To reject knowledge was to risk a grave filled too early. Within this shadow practice lay subtle forms of power. Though men dominated law and pulpit, women traded agency quietly. They spoke over washtubs in fields, or while kneading dough. They became each other's counsellors. The authority of priest and husband did not vanish, but it was balanced in part by these shared instructions. It was a hidden sisterhood, giving women means of shaping their lives where the public sphere denied them a voice. The transmission of recipes became as much a social bond as a medical resource. To trust another with such knowledge was to risk exposure together. The secrecy of contraception also reshaped the boundaries of confession. A woman might kneel before a priest, confessing sins of thought or deed, but not every action reached his ear. Some choices remained unspoken, carried silently as survival decisions rather than spiritual failings. That silence itself was a form of rebellion against total surveillance. The church watched as fiercely as it could, but within kitchens, beds and laundry yards its gaze blurred. People protected what mattered most to them, the power to choose when a family grew larger. We must imagine the mundane details of these acts. A bunch of leaves hanging in a smoky kitchen ceiling, plucked not for stew but held aside with care. A clay pot filled with oil and herbs, hidden under a bed. A woman taking a bitter swallow of liquid under the guise of medicine, telling her family it was for the stomach. These were not grand rituals. They were as ordinary as boiling water, yet carried stakes far greater. Each act bore within it both the promise of relief and the threat of judgment. The most ordinary household tasks became arenas for survival. For physicians, the subject opened a door to their own unease. Some wanted to treat it clinically, reducing the matter to the language of fluids and humours. Others recoiled, safe within moral condemnation that cost them nothing. The debate revealed the split at the heart of medieval thought. The body understood as both sacred creation and vulnerable machine. To intervene in its functions might be seen as an insult to God, but to ignore the suffering of women seemed cruel even by the standards of the age. That contradiction kept the subject alive, never resolved and never erased. Still, for all the weight, secrecy was not total. Episodes exist of women accused, tried, and punished for their attempts. Officials could not ignore rumours when a woman remained childless despite long marriage. Suspicion led to investigation, and sometimes confession was wrung from the accused. Punishment then reinforced the church's stance, but it never stopped others from whispering again over tubs and fires. Even fear could not silence the human will to resist relentless childbearing. Where faith demanded obedience, daily survival created dissent. The truth is, contraception in this period was less about certainty than about effort. Methods failed as often as they worked, yet families clung to them. For each woman who risked herbs or timing, the attempt itself was victory, proof of striving for control in a world that pressed constantly against her. Under watchful eyes, families still carved small niches of choice. These acts remind us that human beings always push against the wall set around them, even when the cost cuts deep. Think of the irony. In towns where brothels carried signs as clear as the tavern, family homes hid their most essential practices in silence. Public sex work was tolerated under regulation, while private birth control drew condemnation. In one case, the city endorsed organisation. In the other, it outlawed autonomy. Yet both existed, both persisted, because human need finds a way. Even under relentless surveillance, even as the church condemned, neighbours found methods to guide one another. Herbs were brewed, timing was counted, and whispered knowledge moved hand to hand. In the end, families shaped themselves not solely by decree, but by clandestine choice. The hidden practices of contraception reveal no less than the resilience of ordinary people. Against the powers of church and state, women still managed to bend fate, if only slightly, to fit their lives. So the regulation of desire did not stop at childbirth. It stretched further, seeking to bind not only fertility but the very acts themselves. Some practices, too private to mention in open sermons, fell into the category of unnatural and earned rebuke even as physicians quietly noted their usefulness. Where contraception whispered of agency, these other habits spoke of solitary need, judged more harshly still, and in that tension between sin and remedy, another conflict unfolded, this time over the private act of solitude itself. 7. The sin and cure of solitude. Imagine being told that the very act you perform in solitude in silence was twin in its nature, condemned as a grave sin by one authority, prescribed as a medical remedy by another. This was the fate of masturbation in the Middle Ages, an act that could place you on your knees in confession one day, and then find itself quietly recommended for health the next. The split between church and medicine was never more striking than here. One spoke of shame, the other of balance, and caught between them was the body itself. Church teaching carried no softness on the matter. To touch oneself was to enter directly into sin, even if no other person was involved. Confessional texts speak of stern penances, long fasts, repetition of prayers, denial of pleasures in diet or sleep. A priest listening at the confessional lattice would treat the admission as serious as theft or blasphemy. Desire was meant to be ordered under marriage, with the act itself given to reproduction. Any other route, whether with another person outside those limits, or alone in the hidden quiet of a bed, was seen as misuse. That misuse carried weighty consequence. To fall into the act was to risk your soul. But then, side by side with that teaching, another voice arose. Physicians, interpreting the body through humours, insisted that fluids must be balanced and that excess or blockage could cause sickness. To them, seed retained too long could corrupt the body, leading to swelling, agitation, even madness. Their logic treated release as a purge, comparable to the bleeding of veins or the clearing of bowels. Moderation was urged. Controlled release was, they claimed, not moral failing but medical remedy. For a man, it relieved tension. For a woman, too, a form of release guarded health. To ignore the body's demand could, so they warned, damage the body itself. Here we find two contradictory logics existing in the same society. When one listened to the priest, touching oneself meant eternal stain. When one listened to the physician, it meant restoring health. Imagine the confusion for an ordinary soul trapped between these voices. To obey confession was to risk sickness. To obey medicine was to court damnation. The simplest act became almost unbearable because both outcomes were dire. Relief came in one direction, punishment in the other. Whichever way you turned, peril awaited. The Church's answer to such temptation was discipline. The handbooks for confessors read like rulebooks for human weakness. A penitent might be ordered to fast for a season, to curb appetite that extended beyond taste to flesh. Or they might be told to repeat endless prayer, using rhythm of words to smother rhythm of hands. Others were instructed to abstain from meat, from comfort, from anything that might fuel desire. The punishments were physical, drawn out, meant not only to cleanse the sin but to weaken the body so that such longing would vanish. The alleged cure was suppression of the self, emptying away energy until desire no longer stirred. Medicine, however, spoke in other terms. A physician would not demand fasts. He would speak instead of measure. He might tell a patient that discharge was no different from a controlled bleeding, to drain humours before they spoiled. He might liken the act to sweating after work, or releasing bile through purging. All were unpleasant, perhaps shameful in polite company, but necessary to live. In their writings, the body was a vessel prone to rot if not cleared of excess. Masturbation was named not for joy, but for necessity. A clinical purge, valued at the same level as swallowing bitter herbs. Consider the psychological impact on those caught in between. A young man, warned by sermons that even stray thought of lust corrupted the soul, meanwhile heard whispers that his health would break if he did not let seed escape. A woman, told by priests that chastity was her virtue, might hear from some learned text that a body without release could wither or ache. Both heard conflicting instructions, both spoke to power, and both left the person trapped. What authority does one obey? The eternal soul or the fragile body? Whose law do you follow, when each tells you resistance is a different kind of death? In this confusion, secrecy became the default. Few admitted their private actions, not even when bodies ached. The confessional demanded honesty, yet honesty brought punishment. Doctors might write about the body's need, but the common person repeated these words in whispers only. To admit too much was, too, risk misguided retribution, either spiritual or social. So the act lingered in silence, hidden beneath sheets and behind shut shutters, unspoken though present. It existed like smoke in the rafters, visible if you looked carefully, yet unacknowledged in public. What is striking is the way these two authorities framed the same action. To the Church, it was rebellion against God's law, indulgence of self, disordered lust. To medicine, it was balance restored, decay prevented, health saved. They could not agree, and society offered no resolution. Both views circulated at the same time, leaving individuals to carry contradictions in their own skin. The act became dual in identity, a sickness and a cure, a fall and a treatment, guilt and relief, Every gesture was both transgression and therapy. Punishments in the church could be severe. Long penances reminded the guilty not simply of error but of bodily cost. To go without food for days, to rise in the night for prayer, to kneel on stone until flesh bruised, these were the courses of correction. The body bore the price of its supposed corruption. Yet, from the physician's side, correction meant opposite steps. Avoid endless prayer, it drains your spirit. Avoid fasts, they weaken the flesh. The clash of remedies shows just how deep the divide was. Neither side moved toward the other. Both retained their own logic, reshaping lives caught in between. Imagine confession for a moment. You kneel, admit your solitary action, whisper what you cannot say aloud before family. The priest listens, frowns, commands penance. You walk away, burden fallen heavier, hunger left as punishment, shame chairing you within. Now consider a physician's chamber. You stand, pale, trembling. He folds his hands, advises relief in solitude. He declares your symptoms demand it. Where one condemned, the other prescribed. The distance between those rooms was the distance between two worlds, and yet they shared the same town, the same people, sometimes the same person. The tension did not remain only in theory. It shaped real lives, pressing unease into each layer of daily existence. The knowledge that your body might betray you, that desire itself was illness and remedy both, haunted the bed. Some resisted, holding fast to priestly warning. Others complied with medicine, hoping to save health. None found peace. The act itself carried no simple name. It carried two, and they moved in opposite directions. To follow one was to betray the other. The only constant was that guilt remained no matter which course you took. Still, these contradictions tell us something. They reveal how medieval people were pulled between two absolute authorities, both demanding obedience, both unwilling to yield. The priest demanded purity as the road to God. The doctor demanded bodily care as the way to survival. The ordinary man or woman bore both burdens. Their body became the battlefield of higher powers, torn between eternal salvation and daily health. That tearing is the truth of medieval solitude. What should have been entirely private became public property of church and medicine alike. It is difficult now, when privacy is assumed, to imagine such exposure. Even your hidden acts were judged, weighed, and taxed with consequence. No boundary shielded you. Not even your own thoughts were free from suspicion. Masturbation was the proof of this surveillance, that an act done alone without witness could still bring penance, while another authority claimed it cured your very ills. We see in this tension a society never at rest, one that mistrusted the body even as it sought to manage it. The body then was caught between two masters. One promised health, the other promised salvation. Both declared authority over every gesture you made. Alone at night you carried this dual command, and whichever choice you made, you obeyed one command only by breaking the other. That paradox defined life as much as hunger, warmth, or faith itself. Still, not all expressions of intimacy lived beneath this stark medical spiritual feud. In castles and noble courts, another language spoke of desire, not tied to solitary shame, but framed in ideals of romance, devotion, and longing. It mingled politics with poetry, obscuring bodies beneath song. There intimacy took yet another strange form, draped in ceremony and courtly words, far removed from the household struggles of sin and cure, and within that world love itself became its own contradiction, torn between arranged duty and secret yearning. The truth is, what we call privacy is a fragile invention, one that most people in the Middle Ages could hardly picture. To them, intimacy unfolded in crowded rooms, beneath the scrutiny of faith, the arithmetic of medicine, and the gaze of family. Walls had not yet whispered their protective silence. If you enjoy journeys into these hidden corners of history, consider subscribing, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Tonight we saw that intimacy was never sealed away. It was lived openly, shaped at once by survival, by ritual, and by the very absence of walls.